You are standing in an ancient settlement. The sun has just risen high. There are no faucets. There are no refrigerators. There are no bottles of spring water waiting in convenience stores. There is only you, the dry burning thirst in your throat, and a stream of crystal clear water flowing just a few steps away. And at some point somewhere, everyone around you turns their backs on that stream to lift up a murky, slightly sour, bubbly liquid and drink it instead of water. This is the story of why humans chose alcohol over water. It is not about bars, not about glasses of wine at dinner, not about the guy who always drinks a bit too much at every company party. We are talking about the first time a human being had clean water within reach and still reached for something that had fermented. And why that could be one of the oldest habits our species has ever had, because this is something no one tells you. Drinking alcohol did not begin with breweries or vineyards. It did not begin with ancient civilizations or temple rituals or even agriculture. The thirst for alcohol may be etched into us at a level so deep that it existed before humans themselves. And the evidence for this is truly insane. Let us begin with an enzyme, because before you can crave alcohol, before you can make alcohol, even before you can get drunk from alcohol, your body needs one single and supremely important thing: the ability to break down alcohol without keeling over dead. And that ability has been part of our family story for a span of time so long it is almost unimaginable, longer than humans themselves, long enough that to find its starting point, you have to go back about 10 million years. The evidence for this comes from a study published in the year 2015 in the journal PNAS, led by a scientist named Matthew Kerrigan. The problem with their subject is that enzymes do not fossilize. They do not stay in bones for someone to dig up and measure. So the research team did something that sounds like science fiction. They reconstructed extinct enzymes. They traced the gene for this enzyme across 28 species, spanning 70 million years of primate evolution, reconstructed its sequence in the bodies of ancestors who died tens of millions of years ago, then inserted those ancient genes into bacteria so they would produce real enzymes, and measured how fast each version broke down alcohol. That enzyme is called ADH4, and at that time we were not even human yet. It was a distant common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas, a creature with a much smaller brain, still fumbling between the treetops and the ground, and completely unaware that 10 million years later its descendants would use this very same enzyme to survive a wedding party. For most of that journey, stretching fully 50 million years, our ancestors' ADH4 enzyme was almost useless against alcohol. It broke down ethanol so slowly and weakly that even a small amount would accumulate and knock the body out. In other words, your distant ancestors were extremely easy to get drunk, and none of them had the liver to do it a second time. But this is where things get interesting, because about 10 million years ago, one single thing happened: a mutation. Just one lone change in the protein sequence, a tiny swap so small it looked like a typo from nature, turned that sluggish enzyme into a machine that broke down alcohol 40 times more efficiently. Not a little faster, 40 times. And that leap appeared right in the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees and gorillas, right around the time our lineage began leaving the treetops to live more on the ground. And this is not some fringe theory or a fun guess. These are real enzymes resurrected in the laboratory and measured with specific numbers. What it overturns is truly worth noting. For many years, people took it for granted that humans' strong ability to process alcohol only appeared about 9,000 years ago, right when we began deliberately fermenting fruit and grains, as if the enzyme had evolved to catch up with our drinking habit. It turns out the chain of cause and effect was completely reversed. That ability had already been present in our ancestors' bodies millions of years earlier, waiting, ready, long before anyone knew about yeast, about pottery jars, about the concept of brewing. Think about that for a moment. The entire world of wine, of breweries, of every toast humans have ever known, all of it stands on a single molecular typo in the body of an animal that did not even know how to walk upright yet. Your body was programmed to process alcohol before you even became human. But an enzyme only explains that you can process alcohol. It does not explain why you would seek it out in the first place, and that is a completely different question. To answer it, imagine a scene that played out millions of times on the forest floor, so ordinary that no one noticed, but it is where the real story begins. A ripe fruit falls from the branch, lands in the layer of decaying leaves, and lies there under the humid heat. Time passes. Inside the skin, natural sugars begin to break down. Invisible yeast spores in the air land on the sweet flesh and quietly start a process older than any kitchen: fermentation. Yeast eats sugar, and what it excretes is ethanol, slowly soaking into every fiber of the softening, rotting fruit. That slightly sour, sweet, fermented smell rises and spreads far through the humid forest air, much farther than the scent of a still green fruit on the branch. This is the heart of an idea that biologist Robert Dudley at the University of California, Berkeley defended in his book from the year 2014 titled The Drunken Monkey. His argument is surprisingly simple. For a fruit-eating creature that has to forage all over the forest for energy-rich food, ethanol is not a toxin, it is a signpost. The smell of alcohol on the wind signals that over there is a fruit that has ripened to its peak, the sweetest, the highest in calories. The one that can follow that signal finds food faster, survives better, and leaves more offspring. Thus, over millions of years, our ancestors not only tolerated alcohol, they evolved to be drawn to that very smell of alcohol, to actively follow it like the promise of a good meal. For a long time, this remained a beautiful hypothesis, but lacked direct evidence, until people went looking for the answer in nature itself. In the year 2022, the team of primate researcher Christina Campbell, along with Dudley himself, published in the journal Royal Society Open Science the results of tracking wild black-handed spider monkeys in Panama. The jabo fruit that the monkeys ate had a natural ethanol content from 1 to 2%, about half of a light beer can. But the key question was not whether the fruit had alcohol, but whether the monkeys actually used that alcohol or just let it pass through their bodies. So the research team did something that sounds a bit funny, but turned out to be the most valuable evidence. They went and collected the monkey's urine. And in 5 out of 6 samples, they found ethyl glucuronide along with ethyl sulfate, 2 substances that only appear when the body actually breaks down ethanol for energy. In other words, the monkeys were not accidentally ingesting alcohol, they were burning it as fuel. By the year 2026, a study in the journal Biology Letters even estimated that wild chimpanzees take in about 14 grams of ethanol each day during the peak ripe fruit season, turning alcohol into a regular part of their diet. And this needs to be said clearly to avoid misunderstanding. The monkeys were not drunk. They did not stagger. They did not pass out. They did not throw parties in the trees. The alcohol concentration in the fruit was too low, and their bellies were already full of fruit pulp long before their bodies could reach any level of intoxication. For them, ethanol was never about getting high, it was about eating, about calories, about a navigation signal. That means the pull that draws you toward a glass of alcohol, the reflex that makes the smell of fermentation attractive instead of repulsive, is not something humans invented in the drunken haze of parties. The craving for alcohol is not a human invention, it is an inherited legacy from fruit-eating ancestors, but an inherited legacy is invisible. It lies in genes and instincts, not something you can dig up from the ground and hold in your hand. So now let us leave the forest and step into the archaeologist's question. Where is the oldest direct physical trace proving that humans actually made alcohol? The answer takes us to a Neolithic village named Jiahu, located in Henan Province, China, and it dates to about 7,000 years before the Common Era, that is nearly 9,000 years from us today. There, molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern and his colleagues published in the year 2004 in the journal PNAS the results of analyzing the dry residue still clinging to the inside of ancient pottery shards. They did not guess, they did not infer from the shape of the jars. They ran the residue samples through gas chromatography and liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, through infrared spectroscopy, through isotope analysis, tools that could identify the chemical fingerprints of each component even after lying still for nearly 9,000 years. And what emerged was not some crude liquid that someone accidentally let ferment. It was a recipe, a deliberately mixed blend of rice, honey, along with hawthorn fruit and grapes, each ingredient playing a role, all selected and combined by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. This is the oldest confirmed fermented beverage recipe in the entire world, and what is astonishing is that it was already sophisticated from the very first moment we see it, with no clumsy stumbling phase preserved. But that very fact leads us to a mental trap that many people fall into. People easily conclude that because the oldest evidence is 9,000 years old, humans must have started making alcohol around then. This is a serious mistake, and to understand why, think about what survives through time and what does not. We find stone tools from 3 million years ago for a very simple reason. Stone is almost indestructible. It lies in the earth for millions of years and still keeps its shape. But almost everything related to early alcohol was made from organic materials. A dried gourd holding fermented fruit juice, a leather bag, a wooden pit lined with leaves, a handful of softened soaked grains, all of those things decompose and vanish back into the soil in just a few centuries, leaving an absolute zero for archaeologists thousands of years later. In other words, the fact that we have not found 50,000-year-old alcohol jars does not prove that no one made alcohol then. It only proves that if they did, that jar had turned to dust long before anyone thought to look for it. The residue at Jiahu survived because it clung to pottery, one of the very few materials durable enough to preserve the story. The oldest evidence we have is only the farthest point that the material memory of Earth can still reach, not the moment when everything began. And that is a principle that anyone who wants to understand the past must engrave in their mind. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And the very man who read the story in the pottery residue at Jiahu, molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern, is also the person who spent most of his career defending an idea that made many colleagues frown for decades. That idea sounds almost teasing, and it can be summed up in one single question. What if humans did not domesticate grains to make bread, but to make beer? That question is not new. Since the year 1953, in a symposium recorded in the journal American Anthropologist with the half-joking title, "Did Man Once Live by Beer Alone?", scholars had raised this bold possibility. For many decades, most researchers viewed it as a sidebar anecdote, a fun hypothesis to debate over dinner rather than something to pursue seriously. After all, everyone knew bread was the foundation of civilization, and beer was just a luxury that came later. But McGovern looked at the very process and saw the opposite. Think about what bread really requires. You have to harvest the grains, separate the husks, grind them into flour, knead with water, then bake at high enough heat in an oven that itself had to be invented first. That is a complex chain of operations, labor-intensive, requiring accumulated knowledge across many generations. What about beer? You soak the grains in water, leave it in a warm place, and wait. Wild yeast in the air finds it on its own. The fermentation process starts without anyone giving orders, and what you get back is a liquid that contains energy and also brings a pleasant feeling. In pure technical terms, making beer is much simpler than making bread. It almost happens by itself. And McGovern put on the scale a question of deep human nature, between hunger and thirst, between the desire for another form of starch and the desire for a drink that changes how you feel, which is the stronger force to pull an entire group of people into sowing, tending, and waiting season after season? For him, thirst is a stronger pull than hunger. And if that is true, then perhaps alcohol was not a reward humans gave themselves after they had settled down, but one of the reasons they settled in the first place. This is still a hypothesis. It must be emphasized as such, a sharp argument about logic and human nature rather than something proven by earth and stone. People laughed at that researcher for 60 years. The question is, does the earth stand on his side? But before the earth could have its say, we must go back and address something that has been hovering in your mind since the opening question. That neat answer that almost all of us believe, that ancient people drank alcohol instead of water because water back then was dirty, full of bacteria, deadly to drink, so alcohol was the only survival choice. This is one of the most common beliefs about history, repeated in books, in movies, in conversations over drinks, so certain that almost no one bothers to check it again. The problem is, when real historians sit down and examine it, it collapses. Researcher Jim Chevalier, in his work dissecting what he bluntly calls the Great Medieval Water Myth, points out that there is almost no evidence that ancient people feared water or avoided it systematically. Quite the opposite. Medieval people drank water, regularly and comfortably. They built houses next to streams and rivers, they dug wells, they channeled clean water from underground sources to cities through carefully designed pipes and troughs. They valued clean water sources and knew how to distinguish good water from stagnant water. Clean water was not a rare luxury that society had to turn its back on. It was present everywhere and used daily. Even ancient medical texts praised water as a healthy drink. The Byzantine physician Paul of Aegina, writing from the 7th century, ranked water among the most beneficial drinks for the body, a view completely contrary to the image that everyone had to hold their nose and stay away from streams. And the beer that people imagine as some kind of life-saving water was actually very different from the modern image. The kind of beer that the vast majority of common people drank every day, the so-called light beer, had an alcohol content so low it was almost negligible, around 1%, a familiar everyday drink at meals rather than a detox dose one had to chug to avoid dying from water. People drank it because it was available, because it was part of their lifestyle and culture, exactly the way we drink tea or coffee today without anyone thinking they are doing so to avoid some poisonous water. In other words, the premise right in the title of this story, the idea that humans chose alcohol instead of water, turns out to be built on a foundation that is largely imaginary. They never truly abandoned water in exchange for alcohol. Both coexisted, both were drunk, both had their own place in life. And that puts us in a much stranger position than when we started. Because if ancient people were not forced to drink alcohol because of dirty water, if clean water was always right there within reach like the stream in the settlement you stood looking at in the beginning, then the force pulling humans toward alcohol for tens of thousands of years, strong enough for them to farm for it, to build for it, to worship it, must come from a place much deeper than the fear of dying of thirst. The question in the title just collapsed before your eyes, but the truth is even stranger than the myth, and the earth, it turns out, has a lot to say. Let us go back to Jiahu, the 9,000-year mark we called the oldest confirmed alcohol recipe, then go back further, deeper into the shadows of time, to a cave near the city of Haifa in Israel named Rekafet. In the year 2018, a research team led by archaeologist Li Liu, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, reports a discovery that pushes the entire timeline back. Inside the cave, they found stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock, and when they analyzed the residue left inside, they recognized traces of wheat and barley that had been soaked, sprouted, and then left to ferment. It was beer. Beer brewed in a cave about 13,000 years ago, in a setting tied to burial rituals, where the living apparently prepared this drink to send off the dead. But the number 13,000 years is only half of what is shocking. The other half lies in the fact that the people who made that batch of beer, a group of hunter-gatherers called the Natufians, had no knowledge of agriculture yet. They did not plow, they did not sow, they did not plant a single grain. They gathered wild barley by hand among the hillsides, harvesting what nature provided rather than actively producing it. Yet in that wandering life, making beer was important enough that they figured out how to do it before they even knew how to farm. This completely reverses the story we were all taught, the seemingly obvious sequence that first humans settled down, then invented agriculture, then had surplus grains to leisurely make alcohol. Rakefet says the opposite. Here, alcohol came first, when humans were still moving, still had not driven a single stake into the ground to call it home. And this is not a lone outlier case. Only about 1,400 years after that, in southeastern Turkey, an extraordinary site named Göbekli Tepe appeared, dating to about 11,600 years ago. It arose before the people in the region knew agriculture, before they knew how to make pottery, before they had permanent houses to live in. And right at that unbelievably ancient place, archaeologists found chemical traces of fermented grains left in the stone, early signs that people had brewed beer there, at one of the oldest structures humans had ever built. From the hills of the Near East all the way to the Americas, where later indigenous peoples made corn beer called chicha, the same story repeats with different ingredients, different names, lands separated by entire oceans. Humans everywhere, independently of one another, without a single word exchanged, all found their way to fermentation. Before crops, on every continent, this is not a phenomenon of one culture, this is a phenomenon of a species. But if humans everywhere all found their way to fermentation, and did so before there was any practical reason to do it, then we are forced to ask a question deeper than everything that has been said. Not how, not when, but why. Why would a species, simultaneously and independently, on every piece of land it set foot on, plunge headfirst into creating things that alter the sensations inside their own heads? In the previous part, when talking about monkeys and fermented fruit, we saw a completely practical motive. Ethanol was a food-finding signal. Calories, pure survival, and the monkeys never aimed for intoxication. But humans are different, and this is the important fork in the road. Humans did not just accidentally ingest alcohol while looking for food. Humans actively pursued the very state that alcohol creates, the feeling of the mind being shifted to another place. And that is not a modern vice. In the 1980s, psychopharmacologist Ronald Siegel at the University of California, Los Angeles, put forward a controversial but powerful argument that the pursuit of altered states of consciousness is a fourth drive, standing alongside the three basic biological drives that everyone acknowledges: hunger, thirst, and sexual desire. According to him, this is not a learned preference or an imported vice, but an impulse wired into the nervous system, something we carry as part of being a living creature. And the evidence for that argument is scattered throughout human history in a way that is almost impossible to deny. Almost every culture ever recorded, on every continent in every era, found its own path to reach that state. Here they fermented fruit and grains into alcohol, there they chewed leaves containing active compounds, elsewhere they burned herbs to inhale the smoke, still elsewhere they ate wild mushrooms that made the world blur and distort. These peoples had never met one another, had never exchanged a single idea, yet all arrived at the same destination. When a behavior repeats independently everywhere humans exist, to the point that there is not a single significant exception, it is no longer a cultural accident. It starts to look like a feature of the species itself. People even like to tell that even elephants wade through to find fermented marula fruit to get tipsy, though scientists still argue fiercely about this, because an elephant that large would need a huge amount of fruit to actually become intoxicated. The elephant story may be true or not, but it is not what this argument needs to rely on, because the most convincing evidence already lies right within ourselves. The impulse pulling humans to seek change in the mind is not a random choice. It is a thirst in the true sense, a thirst that alters the mind as deeply as hunger and the thirst for water. But there is one corner where the myth touches the truth. Because even though the idea that ancient people were forced to drink alcohol instead of water because of poisoned water is wrong in general, there were still very specific circumstances in which the beer in people's hands was truly safer than the nearest water source, and that can be measured. In the year 2024, a study in the Journal of Development Economics with the blunt title "When Beer is Safer Than Water" tracked historical data from England and found a chilling connection. During periods when beer was scarce, when taxes rose or grain failed, the death rate edged up, most clearly in the summer months, right when waterborne diseases raged the hardest. In certain places and times, having beer to drink instead of relying on contaminated water sources really made the difference between life and death. The reason lies in the brewing process itself. To make beer, people had to boil the wort, and boiling water kills most pathogens. After that, even small amounts of ethanol create an unfriendly environment for bacteria. Low pH does the same, and where they used hops, the bitter acids in the hops added another layer of antimicrobial protection. A study from the year 2012 in the Journal of the Institute of Brewing describes these layered barriers, and the key is that they were all byproducts. Ancient people boiled and added hops for flavor and preservation. They accidentally invented a water purification technique thousands of years before anyone knew what bacteria were. Nowhere shows the power of this drink more clearly than ancient Egypt, where beer was not a side pleasure but the infrastructure of the entire society. The workers who built the colossal monuments were paid in part with beer, distributed in regular rations like a form of food rather than money, a standard recorded most clearly in the workers' village near Giza. And that made sense, because for a person hauling stone blocks under the scorching desert sun, that strong, energy-rich beer provided real calories and nutrients. Beer was not just a drink, it was almost lunch. Then there is its medical side, when Egyptian physicians mixed herbs into beer and prescribed it as medicine for all kinds of ailments, from stomach pain to infections. Stop and look at the picture that just emerged. In a single cup, the same murky liquid was simultaneously serving as wages, a water filter, a full meal, and a dose of medicine. It must be said for balance that the greatest value of beer to ancient people was still energy and medicine, and safety was just one aspect and only true under certain conditions, but that narrow aspect was important enough that it cannot be dismissed. The myth is wrong in absolute terms, but right in a narrow corner, and that narrow corner was once the line between life and death. But wages, meals, and medicine still serve individual people, and if we stop there, we have not yet touched the greatest thing alcohol does for humans. Because this drink does not just sustain one person, it binds many people together, and this is probably its deepest power. Modern neuroscience has shown that when a group of people share a common experience, especially a ritual involving shared drinks that alter sensation, their neural activity tends to synchronize, trust between them increases, and the sense of belonging to the same group becomes deeper in ways that can be measured. Alcohol, in other words, is a bonding technology. And if you want to see that technology operating at a scale that changes history, go back to Göbekli Tepe, the very 11,600-year-old site we mentioned, but this time look at it not as a timeline marker but as a social story. For many decades, archaeologists wrestled with an almost absurd question. What could make groups of nomadic people, without agriculture, without houses, voluntarily organize a massive labor force to drag stone pillars weighing more than 10 tons up the hill, erect them into circles, and then meticulously carve animal figures onto the stone faces? There was no king giving orders, no state apparatus forcing them, yet the structure still rose. Then people found large stone vats on site, big enough to hold beer for an entire crowd, and a hypothesis gradually took shape. Göbekli Tepe was not a place to live, it was a place to gather. People came from all over the region, assembling for rituals and feasting, and they drank together. The very prospect of gathering, of sharing that drink, of belonging to something larger than themselves, may have been the strong enough motive to organize the first large-scale cooperation in human history. Beer built the crowd, and the crowd built the stone pillars. That binding power later gained a sacred layer. The Egyptians believed that beer was a gift created by the god Osiris himself and given to humanity. They offered it in temple rituals and placed it in funeral rites, turning a drink into a thread woven through both worldly life and the spiritual world. And when you put it all together, one thing becomes surprisingly clear. The circle of people sitting together passing a shared drink is not simply a party. It is the infrastructure of the first civilizations. But every beautiful evolutionary story has a crack, and the crack in this story is frighteningly large. Remember the ADH4 enzyme from the beginning, the 10-million-year-old mutation that gave our ancestors the ability to process alcohol and paved the way for the entire long romance between humans and alcohol. That entire sophisticated system was honed to deal with something very specific, the tiny amounts of alcohol in overripe fruit, the 1 to 2% level we saw with the monkeys earlier. That was the ceiling nature set. For 10 million years, no source of alcohol on Earth exceeded that low threshold, because naturally fermented fruit simply could not get stronger than that. Our bodies, our livers, the enzymes in our blood, all were perfectly calibrated for a world where alcohol was always dilute and always scarce. Then humans did something no other species had ever done. We invented distillation. In just a few hundred to a few thousand years recently, a blink of an eye compared to 10 million years of evolution, we learned how to concentrate alcohol, separate it from water, pack it into liquids 20, 30, 40 times stronger than anything that existed in nature. Biologist Robert Dudley calls this an evolutionary mismatch, and the phrase captures exactly the tragedy unfolding. The body designed for a world of dilute ripe fruit is now thrown into a world flooded with strong alcohol, a world where alcohol is no longer scarce but cheap and endless, where you can buy more alcohol than your ancestors encountered in an entire lifetime with just a few small coins. The very system that once saved our lineage, the instinct to follow the smell of fermentation to find food, the enzyme honed to make use of every precious drop of energy, now turns against us. It still pulls us toward alcohol with that same primal power, only now what waits at the end of the road is no longer a harmless fallen fruit. The drunken monkey from back then now has an unlimited source of alcohol in its hands, and its body is still stuck 10 million years in the past. So now let us return to where we began. You are still standing there in the ancient settlement, your throat still dry and burning, the crystal-clear stream still flowing just a few steps away, and the people around you still lift up that murky, slightly sour, bubbly liquid to drink instead of water. But this time you see that scene with different eyes. You no longer see a bunch of foolish people turning their backs on clean water out of fear it was dirty, because you now know that fear largely never existed. What you are witnessing is the end point of a thread so long it is almost unimaginable. 10 million years ago, a small creature on the forest floor was drawn to fermented fruit because that fermented smell promised life. 13,000 years ago, still wandering humans brewed beer in a stone cave before they even knew how to plant a single seed. 11,600 years ago, people dragged giant stone pillars up the hill just to have a place to gather and drink together. 9,000 years ago, they already had a proper recipe. 5,000 years ago, great civilizations ran on this very liquid, and the group of people in front of you is simply another link in that chain, doing exactly what their lineage had done before humans even had a name for themselves. They were not drinking alcohol instead of water. It was never like that. They were answering a call older than humans themselves, a call etched into flesh and blood from a time before civilization, before agriculture, before even humans. The thirst for water is to keep your body alive. But that other thirst, the thirst that has guided an entire species for 10 million years, is something completely different. The question in the title was always wrong from the start. Humans never chose alcohol over water. It chose us from 10 million years ago. If the story of this 10 million year call makes you look at a glass of water and a glass of alcohol with different eyes, please subscribe to the channel to join us in tracing the ancient threads that are still quietly controlling your behavior. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because next time we will dig up another secret that humans have carried in their blood since before they knew who they were.